And now, Deborah Kobylt Live.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today on Deborah Kobylt Live. Friend to the show is joining us today, Lisa Napoli, with her phenomenal book, Susan, Linda, Nina, and Cokie. Thanks for joining us, Lisa.
Thank you for having me.
I loved this book. It's so well researched. I mean, I even spent time going over your bibliography. I was like, my goodness, girl, have you really gone over your stuff?
Well, you have to when you're writing nonfiction, right? You can't make it up. Although so much of this stitched so well together, it was almost like I did, but it's all real. It's all real. I had a feeling
You
you'd
know,
like.
yeah, you know what I love? When we talk about the, what do you call it, the mother, what were they, the mother of news, or the first mothers of news, what do we call them?
Founding mothers. Yeah.
The founding mothers. I tried to hashtag that, right, when I was putting something on Instagram, and there's
hmm
hardly any founding mothers. Did you know that? It's like under 100. But if you put founding fathers, you get like tens of thousands or millions. And I thought, there's not a lot of founding mothers out there. So this book talks about the founding mothers of NPR. Now I'm going to have you take it away and talk about what is your book about. And let's introduce these four ladies, please.
Sure, sure. Well, first question is, what is the book about? It's about these four women who couldn't get jobs in the 60s in journalism or pretty much anywhere except in the secretarial pool, which is where women were usually relegated then. And their emergence into broadcast journalism happened at the same time, and not coincidentally, as the creation of public broadcasting, specifically in this case, National Public Radio. So it's the story of these four women from completely different backgrounds, all about the same age, who got jobs at this little startup that became this powerhouse, NPR, National Public Radio. And it's kind of braided in through it the emergence of second wave feminism, as they call what happened in the 1970s, as women were marching for equal rights.
Yeah, it's outstanding. And I love the fact that it was a startup because they sort of took a chance on these ladies, right? I mean, honestly, if you're looking to get a job, people, and it's tough, go look at startups because very often that's a great place to go get started, right? Because you and I were with CNN, and but I was there later, after I think you were there. And it was just sort of an easier place for me to get a job, even though they were well established. But I know friends of mine who started earlier in the business who couldn't get hired, let's say in New York, they went to CNN and they took a chance on them, right? You wrote a book about that too, by the way, Up All
Yeah.
Night.
Last time I talked to you, that's what we were talking about. But yes, you're absolutely right. Places that have lot less to lose are more likely to take chances. And in the early 1970s, specifically 1971, because NPR is 50 years old this year, basically, and we were talking about CNN, which turned 40 years old last year.
Mm.
Basically, these places didn't have a reputation. Nobody knew if they were going to live or die. And so they didn't mind taking a risk on, in CNN's case, people who were inexperienced at that time, and in NPR's case, on women, because women literally could not get jobs, not even just on the air. The on-air jobs, as you know well, are always the hard ones to get, super competitive. But women were locked out of those kinds of jobs in the 60s and 70s, and certainly before that, because women weren't seen as authoritative enough to do what you're doing right now, which is to interview people, live or not. If they did get sent out into the field, it was usually to collect tape and then come back and cut it up and give it to a man to present. So these four women, Susan Stamberg, Linda Wertheimer, Nina Totenberg, and Cokie Roberts, all came into this system, this brand new system. Nobody knew what it was going to be. They were all making it up as they went along. And they just made incredible careers for themselves. They're all still, well, Cokie's passed, but Cokie, up until the
Mm.
weeks before she died, was still a political commentator. They're just indelible presences in the media universe.
Mm. Do you have top of mind the quote from the executive? Because I believe it's in your forward, right?
Yeah, yeah,
About women. Could you repeat that or no? Do you
yeah.
have it in front of you?
I don't have it in front of me. I couldn't say it exactly, but basically, it was I think it was an NBC radio executive who was saying, people don't want to hear women giving the news. They don't believe it. And women are shrill, and women, get hysterical when they're excited, and no one's going to want to listen to women in the news. And the truth is that anybody out there who might be listening, who's old enough to remember that, women, when they were on the news back then, were only doing things like home economics, remember that? Or, cooking or society or wedding reporting or that kind of stuff in both newspapers and on the air. Maybe they were allowed to do some light feature reporting, but it was very unusual to hear women delivering serious news because of executives like the one you're mentioning, who I cite at the beginning of the book, who just said, forget it, nobody will take them seriously, men or women. And of course, that was the belief until these women were given a chance at this little scrappy upstart. Nobody knew what to make of it. Nobody could really hear it, actually, because nobody had FM radios then when NPR started. And then all of a sudden, these women got a chance, and they proved that NBC executive wrong. People did love listening to them. They loved hearing what they had to say, and they trusted them, sometimes even more than them.
Well, because they were all very different. Their personalities were different, and they each had sort of a different role. But I did find that quote, by the way, because I just want my my viewers and listeners to hear it. I'm just going to read a small portion.
Sure.
Women become affected, over dramatic, and high pitched. I read that and it pissed me off because I still know someone, when a woman comes on the air, he will use the word shrill. Her voice is like a shrill. He doesn't. It irritates him, and that's to this day. And I think, wow, that's how you look at us. So it's a real uphill battle, right, for us still. But because of these women and many others, it's made it easier for us. Now let's talk about these women, but also let's talk about the one man in particular, Bill Siemering. Am I saying his name right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's talk about him because he was very, very instrumental in making things happen, right?
Of course. Yeah. Breaking down barriers requires somebody who's innovative and a gatekeeper who lets people in. And Bill Siemering was that person. He was the first program director of NPR when NPR started, and it only had this one show, All Things Considered, every night at 5 p.m. Very little staff. It was under $5 million budget for the entire network of NPR. And Bill Siemering was dedicated to putting alternative voices on the air. And what that meant back in 1971 was people who weren't heard otherwise. In the case of women, in the case of Black people, in the case of just marginalized groups. It's the same conversation we have today about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But Bill Siemering was committed to using these airwaves with which he'd been entrusted to do something different than what CBS, NBC, and ABC were pushing out to the people. And as we talked about last year with CNN, that was the concern, was that those three networks had the stranglehold on public opinion, both entertainment and news. So Bill Siemering was an outlier. He was a rebel, a quiet rebel, but he was a rebel nonetheless. And he saw that in the case of these two women in particular, Susan Stamberg and Linda Wertheimer, that they were immensely talented. And if they were women, so what? And so when they'd initially started, they'd had a man as the host because that was what was expected. And basically, they quickly realized that this man was just mimicking the same tone that they could hear on commercial broadcasting. So they pushed him out of the way. And Susan was so good. She was such a natural. She was such an easy conversationalist that they put her in the chair, and she became the first woman to host a nightly newscast in television or radio in the nation. She was that good.
Also, in terms of the perspective of NPR, I mean, was it a very different perspective politically and all that, even back then, than what was being covered by the traditional TV and radio? What would you say?
It wasn't political so much, it was the tone. It was the
Right.
idea that they were listening back to the people.
Mm.
Traditional broadcasting was talking down, or the way they say it, the voice of the mountaintop, the Walter Cronkite. But what Bill Siemering wanted to do was talk to people, and talk to people not just in the major media centers. This is where it's similar to Ted Turner, although Bill Siemering resembles Ted Turner in no way whatsoever. But the idea was that they were talking to people in Kansas. I'm coming to you from Flushing, Michigan, a very lovely little green burg outside of Flint. It's a lovely place, but people didn't have access back in the 70s to super first rate newspapers. Maybe they got a magazine once a week. And so Bill Siemering's idea was that NPR was going to bring into homes in smaller markets and large ones around the country voices that weren't usually heard, and a perspective that wasn't usually heard. And it wasn't a political perspective, it was more of a conversational perspective. The kind of thing that you do is what he was looking for: a conversation with real people, not just policy wonks or political analysts. And that
Mm.
was a revolution, and at that time, because nobody did that sort of thing, nobody listened to those sorts of people.
No, and what's interesting is I think you know this story. When I was starting out in the business, it wasn't that long ago, at least I don't think so. Back in the 90s, right? I had a news director at a small little station say to me, you know, you look too ethnic. And if you come back on a Monday with your hair a little lighter, then maybe we'll think of putting you on the weekends.
Yep.
Well, what do you think I did back then? It's like, I didn't know where to go. Myself and my girlfriend, we ran down to the local drugstore and we started diving. I mean, could you imagine that happening now? We're not talking 100 years ago. We're talking like, I don't know, 25 years ago.
Right.
Um,
Right.
right? So how long we have come. I mean, and it's because of people like these four women who have paved the way. I even remember working for a network, and this is in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I was using my hands. I was being a little conversational. And when I was finished with the live shot, they said, you can't do that. Your hands must be down at your sides. And I said, that's impossible for me. In other words, I was trying to engage the listener and the viewer. And even then, it was like unheard of. So I love the fact that she came on and he allowed her and she was able to be just Susan. That's incredible.
And she had a New York accent, which, of course, in much of the country read as a Jewish accent. And of course,
Right.
back then, that was, really scary to some people, even in public radio, which is perceived as this liberal bastion. But
Right.
basically, he was so good and so warm and so humane. And no one had
Yeah.
ever heard anybody speak like that on the radio before, or television for sure, that she immediately started getting fan mail. If she had a crick in her throat, people would send in chicken soup. I read some of her fan mail in a library. She gave her papers to a research library, and I went, and thankfully before the pandemic locked us down, went and sifted through these love letters, and they literally were love letters from men and women saying, you are so great. We've never heard anybody like this before. You're the salon hostess. We all wish we could get invited to that salon. How touched people were by her ability to talk to a farmer or a policymaker. So it was unusual, and yeah, it made it possible. Just as Christiane Amanpour helped too, because Christiane
Yeah.
Amanpour couldn't get a job until she got a job at CNN because she was ethnic and she had an accent. Now, of course, that's cool. You get a promotion because of it. So
Exactly. Exactly. But I love in your book how you also talk about their background. You had such great detail in your book. One excerpt in particular describing Susan and how she grew up and how her family had to move down the block because where they were, the burglars would be going up and down the fire escapes. By the way, I remember that because I lived in New York for a time. And the detail going into how she grew up, which sort of shaped who these people are when they're older, is what appealed to me quite a bit as well, because it makes who you are, right?
exactly. No, and I think that that's what's so important is we look at how people become these cultural icons or famous, celebrities or whatever they are, sports figures. I'm intrigued by somebody who's really successful, but I want to always know how they got there. And in the case of
Mm.
these women, even if you don't know who they are, they all got to the same place a completely different way. Susan from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, a nice Jewish girl from a family who had not been educated. Linda Wertheimer came from Carlsbad, New Mexico, where her parents were grocers. And she'd never been east when she got a scholarship to go to Wellesley College, and which she had to take the train to, by the way, because nobody was flying around the way they do today. No college tours or anything like that. Nina Totenberg, famous Supreme Court justice reporter, her father was a famous violinist. He was world renowned. And so she grew up in a very fancy family, especially compared to those other two women. And Cokie Roberts, her father, and then later her mother, both served in Congress. She was from, great wealth and power from both DC and Louisiana. So you couldn't have four more distinctly different people. And yet they all wound up at this little startup that nobody else really wanted to work for. They were so happy to have the jobs and to find each other. I'm sure you've made friends at workplaces before, but these women had just an incredible, it's like a love story, the bond they had with each other until literally Cokie's death. They were all at each other's side. If their husbands got sick or kids got sick or mothers got sick, they were there every step of the way for decades. And they backstopped each other at work. So unusual. And it's such a great story, especially for young women, to hear that these enormously successful women didn't get there because they mowed over everyone in their path. They were a unified force, and they were aware of the fact that they were forging a trail for the next generation, for us behind them, to come in and work in the media too.
Also, I think the management there, that was sort of the vibe there, right? You don't have to stab each other in the back to make it here. Just do the best job you can. Am I right about that? Because that's something I also got out of the book, was how these four women had each other's backs. And I also believe that's why they were such a success, because it was, force in numbers.
Exactly. And they were aware that they were forging a trail for themselves, for other women, and for the network. They saw they could experience every day as they were out in the field that people were starting to listen to this little scrappy upstart, and that it was building in power and influence. And they recognized that they wanted it to be as good as possible because their names were on it, their voices were on it, and they were the front people, if you will. Not the only front people, but they were on the air, and they didn't want it to be bad. So they really stepped up, and they were like den mothers at work. And in fact, I always think, as I talked to two of them yesterday, I always think if they had decided they wanted to be in management, they could have run the joint, because they were so critically involved in every decision that was made. It probably drove some management a little bit crazy, but the management knew that they needed to trust these women because they had literally invented this format.
Let's talk a little bit about their beats. Now, we talked a little bit about Susan, but let's say Linda and Nina, and then we'll get to Cokie afterwards, because she may be the most, well-known among the four, right? But let's talk about their beats a little bit.
Sure. Whereas Susan always sort of veered more toward arts, and she would always have gone for the more populist kind of interviews, even though she did all kinds. Susan and Linda and Nina were much more of what we would call hard news. They loved chasing a deadline. They loved chasing a lead. Somebody whispered something to them. In the case of Nina Totenberg, what made her really famous was, even though she'd been breaking stories for decades, was breaking the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas scandal, where Clarence Thomas was alleged to have harassed Anita Hill while he was being considered as a Supreme Court justice. Of course, that went through. He is a justice, but it was a big scandal at the time that illuminated for people that there was such a thing as sexual harassment in the workplace. Of course, we're well aware of it today, but back then that was a decisive moment in that dialogue about women's rights in the workplace. But Nina loved chasing stories like that, and that really, to this day, she's chasing stories and loves that. She calls herself a deadline dick. She loves the deadline.
I've got to have her on. I've got to, because yes. I adore her sense of right and wrong. In fact, let's talk a little bit about the Clarence Thomas case. I also recall reading quite a bit about that it almost drew a line in the sand. Well, NPR is sort of a liberal place, and the rest of us are hard news driven, which I thought was very unfair, don't you think?
Well, also it drew a lot. Yes, it drew a line in the sand among people, and it wasn't always just men versus women who believed Anita Hill and believed Clarence Thomas, because it was very much a he said, she said situation. Nobody knew for sure, except the two of them, what was going on. And of course, there was a groundswell of opinion that believed that Anita Hill was trumping up the charges against the Supreme Court nominee. They both happened to be African American, for somebody who wasn't around at the time or isn't aware of it. But they were two Black people, prominent, well-educated Yale lawyers. Anita was younger. She wound up working for Clarence Thomas at the, ironically, the EEOC, where claims were made against people, workplace harassment claims were made, policy was made. And Anita Hill made these allegations quietly. They were not acknowledged initially. And she didn't want her name attached to it. She didn't want to come out today the way women come out and say, me too, me too. And there was a huge fissure in our culture where people either believed one or the other. Clarence Thomas, very conservative, married. Nobody believed that certain people couldn't believe that it was possible that he had done this. And certain people couldn't believe that Anita Hill was making it up. So it was a very decisive time. And so that, of course, as we know well, polarizing news stories attract listeners, viewers, interest. And so it was something that was followed. I think the statistic, I mentioned it in the book, was that the World Series was on during the hearings. And I think that this beat that, the hearings of Clarence Thomas's nominee confirmation hearings, or actually not the confirmation hearings, but the allegations against him by Anita Hill, the sort of showdown between the two of them.
Well, sex sells, right? Whether it happened or didn't happen, right?
Exactly.
I mean, let's think about it.
You got it.
So
you got it.
Cokie, a little darling that everybody loved very much, and is gone way too soon. Yes. She was sort of someone who didn't quite look to get into the business, right? She was traveling around with her husband, did come from quite a Washington pedigree. Can you briefly touch on her? Because I'm sure many in our audience do know of Cokie Roberts.
Well, that's what I found so fascinating. Knowing nothing about her background, I would have just assumed that she had, barreled into her professional world as soon as possible. And that's how she became this best-selling author, commentator on broadcast commercial television, on NPR as well, on public television. I mean, she was a darling of the media circuit, doing speaking gigs and everything. But she didn't want that. Like you say, when she got out of college, all she wanted was to marry her boyfriend. She was mad that he hadn't proposed, because they kept going wedding after wedding, and he hadn't proposed to her yet. And she was 20. She thought, that was it. It's over for me. But he did finally marry her. Yeah, it was a different time. He did finally marry her. She was, I think, 21 by the time they got married, or close. And they did start a family, and she did travel around the world with him for his job as a correspondent. But as, of course, the children got older and she had more time on her hands, she wanted to use her great brain and her wonderful education, and she had a hard time. She had pushback, as did all these other women, which is also so hard to imagine. Can you imagine someone telling Nina Totenberg, you can't do that story, or you can't have this job? But that's how it was back then. Women were not allowed to do hard stories like that. But Cokie, I detail it in the book, finds her way to NPR, which she didn't know. She wasn't familiar with it, but she was happy to have the job. And she initially didn't even want to cover Congress. She had done that. It was the family business. She wasn't interested in going into the family business as a politician, which her sister and by extension, her brother sort of did. She didn't. But she wanted to work, and she wanted to do something. And she wound up, of course, as we all know, or many of us know, covering politics and doing it better than almost anybody.
Incredible.
Like her, she was really good at what she did.
She was smart, wise, a step ahead of the person that she was interviewing. Not that she meant to be, but you just knew that she really, she was so well versed on what she was talking about.
Like,
And yeah, she's very, go ahead.
no, Linda said she was born in the boiler room of Congress. So nobody,
That's
she
right.
literally knew the halls better than anybody, even elected, people who are newly elected. So yeah, quite
Mm.
amazing. Quite
Let's
amazing.
talk about the times. You have Gloria Steinem and so many others who were speaking out for women's rights. Tell me about all that, all these women who would collect and get together at a time that was pivotal and critical for women's rights and frankly all rights, people of color and gay and
Mhm.
lesbian, LGBTQ, all of it. Tell me about that time.
Well, what's so interesting is that these four women were quietly activists, whereas when we think about the 70s, of course, it was a very volatile time, both in terms of, like you say, civil rights for all, and we think about people marching and protests and bra burning, which turns out not to be a real thing, but just an invention of the media. But I focus here on mostly on women's rights, but yes, the civil rights movement for Blacks and people of color was raging too. And what's so interesting is how intertwined they are, which I discuss in the
Absolutely.
moments, and which I don't think I realized as a young woman growing up, but also that these women who I write about in the book were activists in a different sort of way than the Gloria Steinems and Shirley Chisholms and Bella Abzugs. They weren't, you know, walking around with signs, but they were wielding a microphone. And that was what they said. Their power was in being behind the microphone and asking questions that men wouldn't typically ask. If you were asking a lawmaker about some sort of spending bill, basically the men might ask a particular line of questioning, whereas women would ask, well, what's in there for child care? What's in there for elder care? What's in there for health? Women just had a different perspective. That's why the whole argument about diversity, equity, inclusion is so important, because every one of us is coming at the line of questioning from a different perspective. And each of these women had such, even though they were all women, had such different perspectives too. So they were able to be activists at a time when, the first day that All Things Considered started, there was a major anti-Vietnam War protests happening in the capital city that nearly shut the city down. It was nothing like what we saw on January 6th, but it was larger in the sense that it took over the city streets. And these women came to work, or at least Linda and Susan did, because they were there at the very beginning and almost couldn't get to the office because of this protest. So it was a volatile time, and they were reflecting the volatility in society by the stories they chose to tell.
This is such an important book for young people to read, young women in particular, but young men as well. I mean, I show two of my sons this book, and one in particular is very interested in reading it, taking a look at it. But the other night I turned on a sports channel, and there were plenty of women there, not just sideline reporting and asking how did it feel, but finally asking some tough questions in sports. And I thought to myself, wow, how far we've come, because I did want to do sports reporting, and it was like, no way, don't even go there. It's
right.
Like, okay, right. Like, just don't even think about it. And therefore my career didn't go there. But now these women, they're killing it, and they're going toe to toe, head to head with these people, with men, and doing an incredible job. But often it's because of women like this and what they've done and brought to the table. And I want young women to know that history. That's very, very important. How are you getting the word out to them? High school? I mean, you got to speak to the young people too.
It's been great when people ask me, how do I explain to my granddaughter, or how do I encourage my granddaughter? I say, read this book, let them understand. We need to understand the history of this nation, of the media. That's why I wrote the CNN book, to understand where we are today and to understand how far we've come. It's not perfect, as you pointed out, but it's a whole lot better than it used to be. And it's only a whole lot better than it used to be because people stood up and did something about it. And there were people who were bold enough to resist the no, the door in the face. They just kept going. All these women had doors closed in their faces, and they would all be the first to say that they were lucky that they got hired by this place at this moment in time, but they didn't let the bad stuff keep them down. They just kept forging ahead. And I think that's an important and powerful lesson. I haven't spoken to a lot of schools yet. I did speak to a law firm, and I knew that everybody in the audience, even though it was on a Zoom, was very young, because the line of questioning was almost disbelief. Really? How is this possible? Well, talk to your mothers and talk to their mothers. I knew growing up how hard it was for my mother, and she wasn't an educated person who was going out and trying to get a job as a lawyer, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg had, met the resistance that she did when she started out in her career. But I always knew that it was unequal for women financially, if nothing else, because of what my mother told me about. So just everybody needs to just keep telling these stories and explaining it, because it really does help. It helps us move forward.
Well, because the women of today are also going to be paving the way for somebody else who's now 2 years old. They don't even quite know what that might be, but we're always sort of moving it forward, right? It's very important to do that. So yes, I'm glad that you spoke to a group of young lawyers, and hopefully more so in high school and in college, because I think this history is important so that you don't just show up, but that you realize people were there before you. So that you could show up,
Exactly. No, and while you're saying that, I'm thinking about the environmental movement too. We used to dismiss the whole idea of recycling or being concerned about what we consumed and where it came from and how it got there. And now it's obviously critical that we start thinking about that, paying attention to it.
Are you kidding? I just had a debate last night with someone over the phone talking to me about climate change, that come on, it heated up for 200 years in a row. I'm thinking, oh my God, like, where do you even begin with someone like that? In a way, I just decided to just stop, because I wasn't sure I would penetrate at all. But you're right. We have to keep that conversation going. So don't get me started about the climate change. Let me talk to you a little bit, please, about your incredible background in news. You've sort of worked so many places. And one of the funniest ones to me, or most interesting, Paula Poundstone, right? I mean, I read that. I'm like, boy, where hasn't Lisa worked? But she's pretty incredible too. Let's talk about briefly your background.
Well, you're sweet to say that, and you are such an amazing and detailed researcher. I love it. But that I think that's why I'm so intrigued by people like these four women who stayed at one job, not in the same exact job, but at the same place for so many years. Because I didn't have that luxury. Perhaps if I'd been Susan Stamberg, I would have stayed for 50 years. But I have worked around media. Of course, I entered the system at a different time that they all did. And there were more opportunities and a lot of fly-by-night opportunities too. So I worked for places like, and I don't mean that in a schlocky way, I just mean they were startups that never took off. Like I worked for a home shopping channel, a division of QVC, where they hired news producers to, and this is before the internet took off in a commercial sense, before the web really flew. In the mid 90s, there was this division of QVC called Q2, and it was kind of a hip, high-end products that people wouldn't associate with QVC, which was then really seen as very down market. And it was a real fun, interesting place, hard place to work, because we were inventing this new medium of how to sell things to people who were reluctant to buy without touching it. Now, of course, everybody does that. Amazon drops it at the door. But back in the mid 90s, that wasn't the case. And so I've enjoyed a really interesting, completely accidental ride through this late 20th century as these media evolved and changed. I was at the New York Times as the web was hitting and covering all of the changes that happened as a result of that. So I'm always intrigued by technology and how it's changed every aspect of our lives, but particularly communications. So it's been fun. It's been fun. But now at this stage of my life, I love the flexibility of researching and writing books. It's hard. You don't make a lot of money. This is the fun part, talking about it. The rest of it is excruciating, but it's also, it's like doing a giant term paper constantly. And I do like that because I wasn't so good at school. So now here's my chance to make up for it.
This is your school. Oh gosh, I do. Before I let you go, I have to talk about Radio Shangri-La.
Yes.
Please. Extraordinary book. I mean, by the way, this book is your fourth. And I know you've got a fifth that you're working on, but very briefly, can we touch upon Radio Shangri-La? Because that also sort of got the wheels turning a little bit with you, right? About the business, because you started up a station. Could you talk to us about that?
Yeah, yeah. No, it definitely changed my life. And it made me realize that for the second half of my life, I wanted to do something slightly different, adjacent, but different. But I was really fortunate. About 12 years ago, I was at a party with a friend. It was a cookbook party, and I met this cute guy. This is before I was with Ted. And this cute guy at the cocktail party was a tea importer. And he asked me what I did. At the time, I worked in public radio. And the next thing I knew, 6 weeks later, I got an email from him, not asking me out, but asking me to go to the Kingdom of Bhutan in Asia to help start a radio station. And I didn't know when I said yes that it was at the dawn of democratic rule there. They were getting rid of the absolute monarchy and switching over to a constitutional democracy. And they were starting this radio station because they wanted to convince people, particularly the young people, how important it was to vote. And so I came over, think as a volunteer, thinking, oh, high-minded ideals, this wonderful radio station. And of course, all the kids wanted to do was play pop music and karaoke and flirt with each other on the air, which was really kind of funny and interesting. But the whole book is about my experience dropping like a space alien into this completely different world. If anybody's been to Bhutan, they know what I'm talking about. And I had traveled, but not like that, not to really
Right.
places, and about how these people all reacted to me coming into their world. And one of them comes to visit me in Los Angeles and goes missing. I'll leave the story at that because it's a good story. She just comes and vanishes on me one night, and it's all about longing to be someplace than where you are. And
Mm.
it was a really great experience. So there you go.
I mean, yeah, but all of this experience, I think this is one of your most incredible books. And I've read all of them, all four. Could you tell me what you're working on next?
Yeah. Right
Please.
before
Yeah.
you called, I'm working on a book about the birth of the civil rights movement, the
Mm.
civil rights movement through the lens of African Americans, through specifically a woman named Marian Anderson, who was another, like these four women, an unlikely civil rights symbol. She was an opera singer, a classically trained singer who became sort of a pivotal person in a movement reluctantly that launched the modern civil rights movement. It's a really cool story. So it's a hard one. So it's really fun to research, and it's just a nice thing to take a break and listen to her sing. She's long deceased, but yeah, she's a wonderful lady. There you go.
Well, when it comes to research, there's no one who's more in depth. I mean, not really, but this book is so well done. Susan, Linda, Nina, and Cokie. Anything else you want to tell our viewers and our listeners about this? Because please pick it up. And if you have a daughter, a granddaughter, a friend, pick it up for them too, because it's also a fun read. It's not just about the story of people you may have never heard about if you're super young. It's just a great read. It's a fun story about four women, their friendship, their work, and their impact, is what I have to say.
Thank you so much. I'll even read it to you. I recorded all four of my audiobooks. So if you like those kinds of things and you want to hear me talk to you, go for it. I'd love it. And I'd love to hear what you think. So thank you so much. I'm so excited to talk with you about this. I knew it would be up your alley.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm sorry we didn't have more time. I could talk to you for 2 hours, but I appreciate you being here, Lisa Napoli, Susan, Linda, Nina, and Cokie. Pick it up. It's a fantastic read, or you can listen to it too, because as Lisa said, she talks you through the whole book. And I appreciate everybody being here for Deborah Kobylt Live. We are sponsored on this show by Faherty.com, just sort of a great summer collection of clothing, and also HarperCollins books. When you're done reading this one, they'd love for you to read The Lost and Found Bookshop. So Faherty.com and HarperCollins, thanks for being our sponsors. And all of you out there, Deborah Kobylt Live, thanks for tuning in today with Lisa Napoli. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Thanks.
I love our latest collaboration, Faherty. I'm so obsessed with their products that over the weekend I purchased everything from hats, shorts, sundresses, and even a few shirts for my husband at their Malibu store close to where I live. At Faherty, summer is in their DNA, and everything from their blankets to shorts and tees are beautifully woven organic materials, and that's everything to me.
Faherty is about family, and I was so excited to learn that the family who actually started Faherty were from Spring Lake, New Jersey, where I spent so many summers as a kid. And they care about what I care about: simple, top quality clothes for every day, for travel, casual evenings, just the way we live in our family. So please shop FahertyBrand.com and make sure to put in the code DEB20 for your special discount. And happy summer!